Did you think wearing that uniform would get you a pass? He shot an army major in broad daylight, then laughed like he had just kicked a stray dog. Thought a simple apology, a cheap press conference, and everything would get buried like all the other times? Wrong. This time, the victim belonged to the Pentagon, and he will pay for what he did. If you think you've ever seen justice, you haven't seen anything yet. Stay tuned to see how the story unfolds. Scroll down and watch the Pentagon end this joke. Bernard Jackson pulled over to the left shoulder of a suburban road, where the asphalt had cracked into blotchy fragments from last night's rain. A woman stood beside her car with a flat tire, her slender frame buckling as if she might collapse without the support of the window, her eyes glinting with unshakable worry. Bernard was not in civilian clothes. He had just left the reserve unit at Clark Field Base, still wearing his name tag, the small service pin fastened to the left side of his chest. He opened the door and stepped out, not rushing but firm, walking toward the woman without asking her name, gently saying, "Please, stay close to the curb. I'll take a look at your tire." Just seconds after Bernard knelt near the rear tire, the screech of wheels roared from the bottom of the slope. A patrol car swerved sharply into view, its rooftop lights flashing without the siren. It sped forward, veered in a tight arc and halted inches from Bernard's car. Heat surged from the engine as it stopped like a physical warning, startling the woman into a jolt. Bernard straightened, stepped back, and looked directly at the patrol car. Unflinching, he knew that sound. It was not the sound of police coming to assist. It was the sound of someone hunting for an excuse to fault anyone who happened to be standing along this road. They called it a targeted subject. The door flew open. A white man stepped out, broad-shouldered, with a gait that leaned more like someone used to kicking doors than knocking. His hands were empty, but the chewing gum cracking in his mouth was as jarring as a weapon's snap. His eyes scanned Bernard's uniform from top to bottom, pausing on the name tag, then climbing to meet his face. A smirk curled at the corner of his lips, and his voice cut through the wind rustling across the grassy verge. "Step away from the car, you black piece of trash stealing a uniform." The woman didn't have time to say anything. Bernard didn't move. His breath stayed steady, his eyes clear like his integrity. He had heard similar lines many years ago, back when he was still a lieutenant, before the bronze band ever touched his shoulder, before he had to request permission to leave training camp just because of his skin color. But this time was different. He was wearing that uniform officially, had just completed an emergency drill, and had signed a special incident report less than an hour earlier. And now, in front of him, stood someone representing the law enforcement system, wielding power like it was a personal game. Bernard exhaled once, then reached into his chest pocket and pulled out his hard plastic military ID, holding it straight toward the officer. The motion was calm, yet firm. It was clear, neutral, and something he had rehearsed dozens of times in urban survival courses he once taught to rookies. Dalton Craig didn't look at the card. He glanced at it, sucked on his candy again, and took a slow half-step forward. A gust of wind blew open Bernard's jacket, revealing a small American flag patch on his left shoulder. Dalton gave a crooked half-smile, as if what he saw wasn't a national symbol, but a failed costume. I said, "Step away from the car. Don't act like some thief," he repeated, his voice now sharpened, with the tone of someone who didn't want to say it a third time. Bernard remained still. He didn't yet know what to do next. Only that any movement could be misread, but standing still meant his very body might be turned into justification for whatever reaction the other side wanted to force. Between those two choices was a very narrow space, where only one thing remained: dignity. And for Bernard Jackson, dignity was never up for negotiation. Dalton glanced at the military ID as if it were a piece of trash not worth sorting. He didn't touch it, just looked briefly, then turned halfway and walked directly to the front of Bernard's car. His boot stepped onto the damp asphalt, leaving muddy smudges behind, the way someone would who had no intention of listening. Bernard lowered his hand, still holding the ID, and slightly turned as if to ask what else the officer needed. But the question never formed, cut off by the sharp bark, "Don't resist." Dalton slammed his hand against the driver's side windshield, the smack cracking through the air like a whip on pavement. The woman, a few steps away, gasped but froze, unable to move. Dalton breathed heavily, as if his restraint itself was humiliating. He didn't wait. One hand braced the hood, the other reached for his belt, eyes slicing across Bernard like a blunt weapon. Maybe he didn't want any explanation. Maybe he was too used to the script where a black man in uniform was automatically a provocation. Bernard took a slight step back toward his car door, not out of fear, simply because he knew his limits were being deliberately tested. Any movement now could be twisted into a threat. In the military, he had taught soldiers how to stay calm under fire, trained them to handle armed urban conflict. But none of those courses had prepared him for this, being targeted by those trained to protect civilians in peacetime. And slid beneath his collar, the cloth strip reading B. Jackson fluttering as a quiet reminder that he was still standing where he was meant to be. In that space, a crack tore through the air. Bernard's body jerked instinctively, as if it knew the moment life was pierced. Blood surged up his neck, spilled across the camouflage trim, soaked through layers of fabric that had been crisp just moments ago. He collapsed, not from pain, but in stunned disbelief, as if his brain hadn't yet processed it, but his heart had already changed its rhythm. Dalton stepped back, gun still aimed, knees bent in a defensive stance. He didn't approach, didn't call for help, as if he had never intended medical aid, never considered consequences, never cared who Bernard was. All he did was stand there, watching the black man in front of him fall, still clutching a card that read, Lieutenant Bernard Jackson, United States Army. No one spoke. The woman now covered her face, head bowed, as if punishing herself for letting someone step out to help. A few other cars passed slowly across the street, but didn't stop. The name Jackson now spread across the ground, not as a title, but like ink smeared across an unwritten investigative report. And the one who caused it remained there, eyes unblinking, as if waiting for someone to nod in approval of what had just been done. But no one appeared. Only silence stretched on, like a sentence still waiting to be declared. Amid the empty patch, where the roadside split from the overgrown grass, the military ID card rested in Bernard's hand. His fingers had stopped moving, yet the grip remained tight enough to keep the rigid plastic from falling. In the sunlight, filtered through tree branches, a trail of blood traced down from his wrist, cutting across dust smears picked up when he collapsed. The name Bernard Jackson was still legible, each letter clear, with a small crack along the left edge, perhaps from a fall on concrete during some past deployment. No one touched it. The first person to reach Bernard after he fell was a medic, and they glanced at the card like it was any trivial personal item, unworthy of being recorded in the emergency report. A young man stood on the second-floor balcony of a building over 50 meters from the scene. He had no idea what was happening until he heard a scream, then saw the man in uniform drop. His hand holding the phone trembled slightly as it recorded a silent video lasting just a few dozen seconds. In the frame, Bernard was still breathing, blood spilling steadily toward his sleeve, yet the officer stood still, made no call for medical aid, issued no further orders. The clip ended with a hoarse voice breaking out from behind the camera. "He didn't do anything. They killed him." That line struck like a cold verdict, spoken at the point where no other explanation was left. After uploading the footage to social media, the recorder added no commentary, leaving only the raw file. The clip spread rapidly within the first few hours. Tens of thousands of shares, hundreds of comments analyzing it frame by frame, aligning timestamps. The footage of Bernard Jackson collapsing circulated at an astonishing pace, reaching not only military circles but spreading beyond regional borders. Some independent news sites quickly reposted it, but only managed to quote a few frames before the original link vanished. By the time the video reached its 100,000th share, the account that uploaded it suddenly vanished from every platform. The user disappeared completely. Those who had saved the clip either stayed silent or deleted their posts. Others, arriving too late, saw only one message: "This video is no longer available." A few netizens familiar with censorship mechanisms began to ask questions. Some suspected platform intervention, others theorized pressure from law enforcement. But no one dared to confirm. No one had proof to stand by. In the digital world, truth does not disappear naturally, unless someone deliberately removes it. Elsewhere, inside a room without a nameplate, beneath fluorescent lights shining over a desk cluttered with documents and tangled cables, a man quietly saved the final copy of the video to a silver USB stick. He said nothing, played no sound, his eyes fixed on the screen, where Bernard's collapse replayed on a loop, each frame slicing through the void of a clenched palm. He pressed "Save As," typed in a meaningless string of letters, then removed the device, slid it into the inner pocket of his shirt, and sat upright in his chair as if completing a private task no one on earth was allowed to witness. His breathing remained heavy, not from exhaustion, but because something inside him had lost its balance. His right hand, long accustomed to handling classified documents, had signed hundreds of internal disciplinary reports, seen all kinds of falsified statements, reconstructed scenes and errors whitewashed with the phrase "complex situation." But never before had he seen the face of cruelty captured so clearly. It wasn't the blood. It was Bernard's eyes in that final moment, looking up as if asking, "Is it my turn now?" The man pushed back his chair, stood up, and locked the door with a manual latch. In his shirt pocket, the USB pressed against his heartbeat. He knew that video would never appear on television, would not be included in the police department's reports, and certainly wouldn't be used as evidence if the case were handled administratively. But he also knew that what disappears from the internet does not vanish from memory. Some clips are kept not to accuse, but in case history someday demands evidence for a hearing that has yet to be held. Behind the thick wall, sounds from a closed-door meeting of an internal affairs unit continued to echo. No one mentioned the video. No one asked whether someone was deliberately covering it up. The topic of the meeting was media response and limits of authority. One of them had once served as head of civil complaints. He had just received a printout from an anonymous email attached with an image of Bernard collapse. When he opened the file, he paused at the 12th frame, then deleted it immediately. But in those few seconds of seeing Bernard's eyes, he knew he no longer had the right to pretend he hadn't. From that moment, he began rewriting the report by hand, not following a template, not going through review, no clear subject line, only one opening sentence. "I once believed in the system." A group of veterans found it through a private network, where they often shared updates about incidents that showed signs of dishonoring military service. One of them glanced at Bernard's posture and froze. He had served with Bernard 4 years ago, shared New Year's rations in a makeshift base in northern Kuwait. He didn't need confirmation. Just seeing how Bernard held his military ID, he knew it couldn't be mistaken. Only those who've been accused of being fake soldiers hold their ID like that. Bernard used to say, "I hold this card like I hold my life." That line was shared like a quiet bell among the veteran community. From the original video, several frames were captured and turned into small stills. In one, Bernard is kneeling, eyes fixed on the patrol car. In his hand, the military ID reflects light mingled with the red of blood, creating a smear like a flag of no nation. Those who had ever worn a uniform understood that light did not come from design, it was the glow of a declaration betrayed. And when that image reached the upper ranks of military forums, those who had remained silent began to write their first lines, not long, not furious, but simply asking the question that the media had ignored. Why did no one intervene when a major was shot right in front of them? By the time the ambulance arrived, the road had begun to fill again with people returning from rush hour. The intersection where Bernard Jackson lay still was marked with 2 strips of yellow tape, one looped over a rusted road sign, the other tied to a dry tree branch. The only person left at the scene was the medic, short in stature, face hidden behind a thick mask, who stepped out and immediately unfolded the stretcher without asking a single question. The vehicle's dashboard clock showed their arrival was 13 minutes later than the original dispatch time. Bernard was still breathing as they lifted him, each breath faint, his chest rising in shallow reflex as though the body was refusing to let go. He showed no neural response when his name was called. His eyes remained closed, and his left hand twitched slightly each time the vehicle bumped along the road. During the entire ride to the hospital, no one asked for his identity. The nurse in the back kept her focus on the heart rate monitor, scribbled a few notes, and then wrapped a soft band around his wrist, marking the patient ID as R1X. At the emergency unit, everything proceeded under the protocol for unidentified patients. The military uniform was cut along the path of the bloodstains, sealed into a bag with his items. Bernard's ID card was placed in a small plastic tray, not attached to his medical records, but stored separately under unverified evidence. The report writer didn't question it because, on paper, Bernard Jackson was simply a patient with severe blood loss. No valid identification, no legal guardian, and no emergency contact. Room 19, at the far end of a hallway where the ceiling lights flickered, was chosen for observation. Bernard's bed was pushed against the wall, the IV lines and monitors hastily attached but properly set up. The only person who checked on him regularly was a night shift doctor, a man in his 40s who had served as a military medic in his youth. He said nothing while reviewing the clinical reports, but he paused a long time at the note, "Identity not verified." For a brief moment he studied Bernard's face and frowned, as though recognizing something familiar yet unsure. Then he closed the file and added a note at the bottom. "Close monitoring advised. Potential military background." A young nurse placed a water bottle nearby, her eyes glancing at the band on the patient's wrist. She was curious but remained silent. Everyone on shift had been instructed that this was an R1X case, meaning no contact with outsiders, no statements to the press, no confirmation of anything if asked. One staff member had tried to snap a photo of the records to inquire with the department head, but deleted it shortly after. No one wanted to be summoned by HR over something outside their official duties. Beneath the white sheet, Bernard's body no longer moved, but from the left wrist, where the IV line clung tightly to his skin, a faint pulse still beat steadily. It wasn't strong, nor obvious, but it was enough to keep the monitor from going dark, and that alone made it hard for people in the room to look away for long. Even though no one knew who he was, even though his name hadn't been written into any file, one fact remained undeniable. That body was still fighting to hold on to life, like an old instinct from someone who had once refused to fall, whether on the battlefield or right in the heart of America. Outside the hallway leading to the emergency ward, a man in a field-grade uniform leaned lightly against the glass doorframe, eyes fixed on room 19. He wasn't family, nor was he on the hospital's personnel list. The small nameplate on his left chest read E. Rains, and the rank on his epaulet was enough for passers-by to know he wasn't there for a casual visit. His combat boots still bore a layer of dust, his left wrist carried a training band, and his right hand held a slightly crumpled envelope. Every time a nurse exited Bernard's room, his eyes paused for a few seconds, as if checking for any change in condition. When the night shift doctor passed by for the third time, the officer slowly turned his head. They locked eyes for exactly 3 seconds. The doctor shook his head, accustomed to that silent look from those who had seen too many comrades never wake again. The officer asked nothing. He folded the envelope, slipped it into his inner pocket, and stood still a moment longer before leaving, without leaving a name or contact note. His presence was only recorded by a short line in the duty log. Individual confirmed identity did not request to see patient. As soon as he stepped out of the treatment zone, he tapped out a message from a secured phone. The system took only 3 seconds to deliver it. The command was short with no specific identifiers. 3 words, typed firmly, no period, internal handling. That message required no acknowledgement. The recipient was a special unit, assigned to incidents involving officers harmed outside operational zones. When the words appeared on the other end, no meeting was called, no report was printed. Only a single phone was hung up, and a tracking list gained one more name. At the senior personnel headquarters, a clerk opened the archives and pulled Bernard Jackson's file. It had been marked active duty with 3 emergency deployments and 1 special commendation for performance under pressure. A handwritten note from a former commander read, "Avoids confrontation but has never abandoned a teammate." After Bernard was listed as a victim of a civilian-involved shooting, the entire file was placed under restricted access, meaning only a select few had clearance. The internal legal unit was not informed. The media department received no detail. Those within the system understood that when the Pentagon used the phrase internal handling, It did not mean investigation. It was an order separated from administrative procedure, representing the highest level of organizational discipline. Previous cases with the same label had led to one of two outcomes: transfer of jurisdiction to military command, or complete suspension of civilian parties involved for containment. No press conference was held, no transparency statement was issued. Only a sequence of actions took place behind closed doors, where the one who gave the order also bore full accountability for any deviation. Before the day ended, a short message was relayed back from the command channel to the senior officers coordinating information. No press contact, no public response, only action. And within the inner circle, those who had once held command knew this was no longer a professional mishap. It was the declaration of a system choosing its moment to respond, not through announcements, but through a decision that required no explanation. At that moment, Bernard had not yet awakened, but a part of the machine he once served had already begun to move, quietly, without warning. The internal report from the police department was submitted in less than 2 hours after the shooting. The document followed a pre-formatted template, with names and events slotted in like blanks, the handwriting rigid to the point of feeling cold. The title was typed: Serious Incident Report Involving Suspect Displaying Threatening Behavior Toward Law Enforcement. In the notes section, a summary avoided any detail that might stir controversy. Subject acted aggressively, threatened officer, shot in self-defense. The legal officer nodded and signed. A copy was sent to the internal communications team to prepare an official statement if necessary. Dalton was absent from the meeting. He was granted a week of leave under the justification of psychological recovery after a dangerous situation. The public affairs office closed temporarily, citing system upgrades. No one saw anyone. Inside the command center, where footage from patrol cars and body-worn cameras was stored, a clip was played for verification. The screen showed an angle from Dalton's patrol car, beginning with the sound of impact and movement. Bernard was visible, standing at the roadside, turning his head toward the driver's seat. But as the footage approached the critical moment, when Dalton raised his gun and Bernard collapsed, the image flickered once and turned to static. 1 second of footage was missing, then the image returned, and Bernard was already on the ground. The technician who viewed the clip said nothing, closed the laptop, and noted, "Temporary signal disruption." The black box from the patrol car was sealed and logged into evidence. No one questioned it, as everything fell neatly within procedural bounds. Even the camera glitch at the crucial second wasn't enough to raise an eyebrow from the younger staff. They were used to it. Gaps in footage usually led not to action, but to silence. Dalton left the station with another officer through the back exit. As he got into the vehicle, he said nothing. His eyes bore the look of someone trained to remain calm after each discharge of a weapon. He didn't ask about Bernard's condition. He already knew everything would be documented, the same way as always, in the correct sequence. Subject resisted, officer had to react, action followed protocol, conclusions pending. Everything lined up. In the waiting room of the hospital, 2 blocks away, a nurse quietly updated patient records on the tracking board. Bernard Jackson's name did not appear. In its place was a string of characters beginning with 3 letters. Family information had been removed to protect the victim's identity. Even the shift staff were not permitted to record the reason for admission beyond blood loss due to severe trauma. And no name, no military history, no rank, just a body lying still, covered in IV lines, tagged as though he had no past worth asking about. Down the hallway, a doctor returned to his desk, checking the next patient's heart rate. His eyes scanned the chart, but couldn't help glancing back at room 6, where a man lay quietly, facing a void carved by a nameless bullet. And even though the entire system was functioning as if what had occurred was a routine occupational hazard, there were still a few eyes unaccustomed to treating it as normal. But eyes don't get written into reports, not ever. In a small office at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, Dalton leaned back in a leather chair, spinning a ballpoint pen in his hand and smirking as a colleague blurted out, "This one's gonna get some heat, huh?" He stared straight ahead, eyes absent of concern, and let out a line so casual it sounded pre-recorded. He managed to kneel, just not for the country, It wasn't said in anger or mental unrest. It landed softly like a joke, swallowed into a room where no one objected. A second passed, then another, and someone chuckled faintly as if in agreement. The rest stayed still, neither nodding nor shaking their heads, as if used to silence being a form of complicity that required no accountability. Inside the department, Dalton was still considered someone who handled sensitive situations without creating complications. He was praised for staying calm, for knowing how to present things, for framing incidents in legally sound language. On paper, he was an officer with no disciplinary history. In internal evaluations, his profile was always marked as psychologically stable, and in a system that had long used performance as the only measure of action, even a line of blatant disrespect could be brushed off as stress relief. Meanwhile, local newsrooms began preparing coverage. A quick editorial meeting was held to coordinate how to report the shooting. The chief editor didn't take long to decide. Don't mention military rank. Label him as a civilian in a police interaction. A junior reporter, recently transferred from another region, flipped through the summary and asked, "But records confirm he's a military major, right?" The response came from the communications director. "We don't have independent confirmation. Publishing unverified details violates protocol." The meeting ended ahead of schedule. The news segment was trimmed. The word military appeared nowhere, and no one made an effort to add it. The first official post on the local channel's platform read, "A black male was shot during an interaction with police. He is currently in serious condition." In the comments section, reactions split clearly into two. Some demanded the victim's true identity. Others quickly diminish his role by stating, "If he did nothing wrong, why would he get shot?" Among hundreds of shares, few mentioned Bernard Jackson's rank or unit. Those who knew stayed silent. Those who didn't assume he must have done something to deserve it. A small newsroom, unaffiliated with major networks, attempted to contact the hospital to verify Bernard's identity. They received a phone response from the administration office. "We have no patient by that name in our records." The call ended. The article was shelved indefinitely. And once again, the very information that should have been central to the story was blurred by a network of caution, fear of fallout, and quiet concession. At the same time, in a small cafe on the east side of the city, a veteran, just off a night shift, happened to scroll past the brief news alert on his phone. He didn't know who had been shot, but when he saw the long-distance photo, he paused. That back, that frame, that crouched posture by the car door, it looked exactly like the comrade who had stood beside him in Kandahar. He wasn't sure, but his eyes didn't leave the screen until the low battery warning appeared, and the post vanished from the homepage without a trace. The first news Bernard's mother saw was a ticker running across the bottom of the evening broadcast on a local channel. A young black man shot during tense encounter with police. Identity not yet confirmed. The screen flickered, replaying a blurry traffic cam video showing the shadow of a person kneeling before collapsing beside a gray car. There was no original sound, no captions. The anchor read in a flat tone, ending with the phrase, "We will continue to update as more official information is released by the police." He did not know it was her son. She had not received any phone call from the hospital, the police department, or any agency with responsibility. Bernard had never been late without notice. He was not the type to disappear. But that night, the phone rang once, near 10 o'clock. She answered, and the voice on the line was unfamiliar, but not strange. A man, low-voiced, spoke briefly, each word sounding carefully chosen before spoken. "Ma'am, I think that was Bernard." The caller was a former teammate of Bernard's, someone who had gone through 2 special training rounds with him in Arizona. He no longer worked in their old unit, had left the service nearly a year ago, and was now a technical staffer for a military contractor. No one had asked him to investigate, nor did he have any official reason to follow the news. But when he saw the video that had spread for a few hours and then disappeared, he recognized the way Bernard held his ID card, even spotted the small scar behind his neck. a mark from an old clash only teammates would know. He called Bernard's mother immediately, not entirely certain, but something in him would not allow silence. She collapsed beside the table, holding the phone without fully grasping what she had just heard. When she opened the closet and saw her son's uniform still hanging neatly, with the beret stored in its usual drawer, she prayed it was all a mistake. But by midnight, after calling Bernard's number and receiving no answer, she began to realize the silence was not by chance. In the world she had lived in, when someone in uniform falls, there would be a knock on the door, someone carrying the death notice, someone saying, "We regret to inform you." This time, no one came. The next morning, she went to the local recruitment office, carrying papers confirming Bernard's identity. She was met by a young sergeant who glanced at the documents, scratched his head, and said there were no updates in the system. He searched his computer for 10 minutes, then made a brief phone call and told her she would have to wait. She nodded, sat down on a plastic chair, clutching the folder she had kept untouched for 18 years, never imagining she would have to use it like this. An hour passed. No one returned. The room slowly emptied, the dim light casting shadows on the faded edges of her shoes. The question, "Where is my son?" echoed quietly in her mind, unanswered, with not a single confirmation. And everything she knew at that moment was wrapped in one phone call from someone who had once carried the word "reclaim" on his shoulder alongside her son. The morning after the shooting, Dalton Craig returned to his patrol schedule as if nothing had happened. Colleagues saw him in the parking bay, still with that uneven stride and the sharp snap of chewing gum echoing through the hallway. He wasn't wearing a fresh uniform, his shirt still creased from the night before, the polished nameplate on his right chest gleaming like an undeniable stamp. In the internal briefing, the department supervisor confirmed Craig completed the report and did not violate action protocol. The phrase repeated was "perceived threat," and therefore response aligned with regulation. On the internal system, Dalton's record remained marked as clean. He continued receiving regular assignments, present at high-traffic intersections, showing up in residential zones to maintain visibility. When a local reporter sent an email requesting clarification on Dalton's duty status, the police officer replied, "Officer Craig is performing his duties as usual." No additional notes. No mention of Bernard Jackson. No phrase such as "pending investigation" or "under review." At the same time, on a coastal military base, a Marine just off night duty received an unofficial printout of the deleted video. No audio, no narration, only the image of Bernard collapsing beside his vehicle. He watched it 7 times, eyes fixed on the blood-stained military ID in the hand of his uniformed brother. Then he opened an email, typed slowly, and sent it to the address of a former military group. "Are we letting an officer get killed on American soil?" Among the recipients, someone printed that subject line and pinned it to the command room's mission board. A small group began asking the questions no one wanted to put in writing. Why hasn't the justice system stepped in? If he were military, why is there no martial protection? And then the bigger question surfaced in private meetings, where those familiar with battlefield death now had to face the truth that this time it might not have come from the enemy, but from someone wearing another uniform. At a security training session, a colonel stood before a group of young officers and spoke with calm rage. "We spend months teaching them how to identify external threats, but we have no way to protect them once they come home." No one in the room responded, because they all knew if a major could be shot in broad daylight and no one held accountable, then rank no longer offered protection to anyone. That afternoon, Dalton continued his shift, stopping in front of a school and checking communications on his radio. He didn't know someone was tracking the patrol route, not to harm him, but to confirm whether he was still considered a law enforcer. He also didn't know that every time he appeared on the street, someone recognized that face from the deleted video, the one never aired again. And from that moment on, Bernard Jackson was no longer just a name buried in a file, but a memory awakened day by day by those who refused to forget. When the encrypted screen lit up in the Secretary of Defense's office, the signal came from someone who rarely called directly. Lieutenant General Avery Monroe was not a man easily shaken. In over 30 years of service, he had signed hundreds of death notices, had seen comrades fall before his eyes without so much as a flinch. But this time, his voice could not conceal the weight pressing beneath every word. "We just lost a major," he said, without detour. "Shot like trash." There was no immediate response on the other end. Silence lingered for a few seconds, followed by a faint exhale. No words seemed adequate to meet such a statement. Lieutenant General Monroe didn't wait for a reply. He switched the call to emergency protocol and attached all medical records, a copy of the video, and information confirming that Bernard Jackson's identity had been removed from hospital files. The final line in his note read just 4 words: "This won't be buried." Within 1 hour, a federal-level internal meeting was convened in the Strategic Coordination Room. Those present were not in full uniform. Some arrived in wrinkled shirts and loose ties, bringing only their special clearance ID. No one spoke in formal protocol. The military intelligence director opened with what sounded more like an admission, not public, but must answer. The word answer was stressed, not for the media, but for the integrity of the system. A legal advisor read through the steps already taken by the civilian justice system, then shook his head. "No process has been triggered," he said. "No prosecution, not even an open investigation." A female general, seated to the right, tapped her palm lightly on the table. She didn't speak, but everyone noted the tension. Another participant offered a thought. "If this was individual error, we need to redraw the lines of authority. If it's systemic failure, then we're harboring the enemy within our fence." Each report page was flipped through, not in order. The fragments formed one unmistakable truth. Bernard Jackson did not die in combat. He did not fall on a mission overseas. He was shot on American soil by a law enforcement officer while unarmed, unresisting, and still in uniform. For a segment of the military, this was intolerable. Lieutenant General Monroe didn't need to elaborate. He raised his hand, gaze steady on the figures arguing across the room. "I'm not asking for a statement," he said. "I'm asking for accountability." Silence fell. Everyone knew he wasn't addressing deputies or press reps. He was speaking to those with the authority to act without permission. That silence wasn't hesitation. It was an agreement, unspoken but final. A whiteboard stood in the center of the table with 2 arrows, one pointing to civilian process, the other to internal response. No one selected the first arrow. The meeting ended in 35 minutes, without an official record, without a secretary to transcribe, but everyone who left the room carried a clear directive: identify, isolate, initiate response. There was no official name for the plan, but within military ranks it was called the consequence with no retreat. From that moment on, Bernard Jackson was no longer a forgotten victim. He became the reason, the cause. In a strategy room built for 16 but lit by only 6 ceiling lights that night, the meeting extended until nearly midnight, and no one stepped out for coffee. A female officer with a general's rank, her hair neatly tied back, slowly turned through a file clasped in her left hand, then lifted her head and looked at each person in the room, as if measuring hesitation face to face. When she spoke, her tone was calm but unyielding, striking the air with non-negotiable finality. No one touches a military badge unless they're willing to trade their entire career for a few minutes of power. That sentence was not a warning, it was a declaration, and when spoken by someone who had once commanded on the front lines, someone every security officer knew had been deployed to handle critical response operations abroad, it carried no emotion, only the conclusion of a principle etched into blood and survival. A small sheet of paper was passed by her to the aide sitting nearby, bearing only 2 lines. Bernard Jackson's name, and beneath it, the date he enlisted. No further description, no biography needed. Those 2 lines were enough to mark the boundary between honor and offense. After her statement, no one spoke. Each person returned to their documents, noting down actionable milestones. A single tap on the table from an officer at the end of the room signaled that a silent consensus had been reached. No hands were raised. They had been trained to understand that in a system demanding absolute reflex and discipline, agreement did not require words, only the next action, and it came faster than anyone expected. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, a summons was issued through a special encrypted channel. The recipients were neither civilian forces nor regular military units. It was the Military Law Enforcement Command Group, an independent body operating under direct orders from the Office of Defense. Members were selected from multiple branches. Some were specialists in field investigations, others were tactical commanders with overseas experience, and some had handled politically sensitive military honor violations. The summons listed no specific reason. Each person received only a location code and a requirement to report within 8 hours. Below the digital signature was a line of instruction: prepare to act under Article 9 of the Organizational Level Intervention. That clause had not been invoked in over 10 years, only rewritten during an internal policy review as a theoretical safeguard, never expected to be used in reality. But this time, it was no longer just theory. Across small offices scattered nationwide, lights turned on in rooms thought empty for the holiday season. Doors opened, coordination boards lit up, and a list began to form. Witnesses, data, behavioral chains, blind spots in civilian response protocol, and finally, the name Dalton Craig. No one spoke his name aloud in meetings, but it appeared on every order terminal with the tag, subject to be addressed under Military Breach Behavior Model. Within 24 hours, the Military Law Enforcement Command Group would arrive at the designated site, carrying not a warning but an operational file. They would not speak to the press, would not inform the local police department, and would not coordinate with state judicial offices. They would operate solely under the special authority signed off in closed session back when Bernard Jackson had not yet died but was already treated as nameless. And that was precisely why they had no intention of notifying anyone, because honor, once again, does not wait for permission to resist. Less than 24 hours after the Military Law Enforcement Command Group was convened, a video clip reappeared online, this time from an anonymous account with no profile picture, no verifiable information, and a single caption. "If your conscience isn't enough to act, let the evidence finish the job." The video was longer than the original that had been taken down. It was unedited, without effects, background music, or inflammatory text. The uploader left it bare, allowing the footage and sound to speak for themselves. The clip began in silence, the screen shaking slightly. The camera was positioned from a high vantage point, seemingly filmed through a recording scope. Bernard Jackson came into frame from the right, visible in crisp detail. He stood beside the vehicle, holding his military ID. As Dalton Craig approached, his voice came through clearly, as if recorded from a mic near his mouth. "I know he's military, but he kneels like a savage, so I took him down before he got up." The sound was not one of rage. It carried the tone of twisted satisfaction. No one in the clip objected. No voice intervened. The video ended as Bernard collapsed, just as Dalton's face slipped out of frame, leaving 3 seconds of empty screen. Within 6 hours, the clip had amassed hundreds of thousands of shares, despite continuous platform censorship and takedowns. The more it was deleted, the more copies circulated manually, through private groups, internal emails, and exclusive military and veteran forums. Those who had remained silent began forwarding the video with one question: how many more must fall before the uniform means enough to protect its own? In a sealed room at the Strategic Analysis Center, an internal, legal, and media team reviewed the clip's authenticity. It took less than 10 minutes to match the voice to Dalton Craig's internal training session recordings. Every element is aligned. The statement was undeniably his. Analysts compared pitch, cadence, and consonant articulation. Everything matched so precisely that no second verification was needed. No further investigation was required. The intent was clear. The hateful motive, irrefutable. Every word of that sentence unraveled the entire web of excuses previously spun by the system. On a private forum for senior logistics officers, an anonymous post appeared at 3 a.m., reading only, "If the uniform is no longer the final shield, then honor must demand its return." Below the post was a photo of Bernard, clutching his military ID, blood streaked down one side of his forehead, his eyes still open, as if trying to process what had just happened. The image required no edits, no slogans. It was sent out as a period at the end of any attempt to reframe the incident as a justifiable defense. From the Military Law Enforcement Coordination Office, a file was printed and marked Priority Processing. Inside was not only the clip and audio transcript, but also a list of personnel involved in the internal report after the shooting, along with a communication map of the departments. Every person who had touched the process would be called in, not to be questioned, but to address a breached principle. No one has the right to remain still when a soldier falls at the hands of someone within the same system. Not again. Never again. Within 24 hours of the video resurfacing, veteran communities across the states lit up like a connected electric grid. Once quiet groups, typically filled with updates on medical checkups or reunion notices, suddenly pulsed with outrage. One person reminded another, sharing the video privately and adding the question, if he was a soldier, why did he have to kneel before a gun held by someone not on his side? Those who had never spoken of politics now voiced the anger they had suppressed for years, as if Bernard Jackson's death was the final weight that turned the still water into a rising wave. A group of veterans in Missouri who once served with Bernard in a joint training unit posted an old team photo on their official page. Bernard stood in the front row, holding an M4 rifle, his face serious, never showy. The image was placed side by side with a frame from the clip. Bernard collapsed, still gripping his military ID, blood spreading across his uniform. The caption below the collage read, "We once believed the system would never let this happen. We were wrong." In less than 2 hours, over 30,000 shares followed, along with hundreds of messages from veterans of all ages, unanimously stating that this was no longer about one man, but a shared fracture for all who had ever worn the uniform. At a veteran event coordination center in California, the weekly discussion turned into an impromptu forum. A silver-haired man, once awarded a combat medal during the Desert Storm campaign, stood and read the exact words from the video. "I knew he was military, but he knelt like a savage, so I took him down before he could stand up." The room fell silent. Everyone understood this was not a momentary act, but an attitude fostered by a foundation of discrimination no one wanted to name. And once that attitude was carried inside a police uniform, death was no longer a risk. It was an outcome. Beneath the first anonymous upload of the video, there was only one line left by the person who posted it. "Justice is not optional." 6 words with no icons, no notes, no source cited. Yet those 6 words were printed and taped to the doors of dozens of veteran organizations across the country. Some placed it on billboards, replacing recruitment slogans. Others engraved it on water bottles they brought into conference rooms. A simple phrase, but in that moment, it became a new vow, not just to remember Bernard, but to protect those after him from the same end. In Washington, an internal report from the Military Oversight Agency recorded that over 100 veteran accounts had submitted formal requests for a special hearing. In their letters, they did not ask for a police investigation. They did not request compensation for Bernard's family. Instead, they demanded a closed meeting between military representatives and civilian law enforcement units, with a single request. If the title of soldier is no longer protected on this land, give us a reason to keep believing in what you call justice. On the late-night broadcasts, some television channels were no longer avoiding the subject. Anchors began naming Bernard Jackson clearly, no longer omitting his profession or skipping over his rank. On screen, the words moved slowly. Veterans outraged over the death of Major Bernard Jackson. The truth was surfacing layer by layer, and this time, the fury was no longer buried in post-war stories. It had taken form, visibly, and was now seeking a response, not in reports, but in action. Dalton Craig was not the type to get easily rattled, but 3 days after the video was recirculated, he began noticing unusual signs around him. That afternoon, as he left the station after his shift, he spotted a black car parked tight against the left curb of the lot. Windows fully tinted, no license plate. It wasn't near any other vehicle, just sat alone, facing the exit like it had been waiting before he even stepped out. He slowed his pace, trying to peer into the cabin through a narrow gap in the windshield, but the inside was nearly pitch dark. No movement, no one exited, and when he reached his car, the rear view mirror reflected the black vehicle's lights flashing faintly as it pulled away. No sudden acceleration, no tire screech, no engine growl. He told no one at the station, just stood there for a few seconds, eyes tracking the car as it slipped past the side gate, then got in his vehicle, starting the engine with a slight tremble in his hands. Since joining the force, Dalton had never been the one under watch. He had blocked others, interrogated suspicious figures, but being the subject of surveillance was something he'd never learned to handle. When he got home, he stood in the kitchen, flipping through his file, reviewing recent emails. Nothing. All dispatch data remained unchanged. No warning had been issued, no suggestion to avoid the media or step back from duties. On paper, Dalton Craig was still an officer operating within full procedural bounds. The next morning, he reported as usual, arriving 30 minutes early to review unfinished patrol logs. But when he walked into the personnel office to file a report, he saw a sealed envelope on the secretary's desk, hand-labeled Long-Term Sick Leave Request V. Ortega. That name stopped him. Ortega was a teammate, the one who used to smirk whenever Dalton bragged about subduing non-compliant suspects. They had patrolled together, handled sensitive cases with no formal paperwork. Ortega had never taken extended leave, never mentioned health issues. Dalton stared at the envelope a moment longer, then left without asking. By midday, news of Ortega's leave circulated through cafeteria whispers. Some said he was stressed from the Bernard Jackson incident. Others suggested he wanted to get away before things blew up. Whatever the reason, Ortega's withdrawal at that moment unsettled Dalton. He texted him directly, bluntly. "What's going on?" No reply. He called. The line was off. By the end of the day, Dalton returned to the parking lot again, this time pausing intentionally before stepping outside. No suspicious vehicles. But something still felt out of hand. Small details had begun stacking up. An unmarked car appearing and vanishing. A colleague exiting without explanation, conversations dropping silent whenever he entered a room. Though no one said a word, Dalton started to grasp that he no longer stood on safe ground, and perhaps those watching didn't need proof to act. They just needed a motive, and the name Bernard Jackson, for some, had long been enough. Inside a closed-door meeting at the City Police Command Office, the air felt heavy despite the sunlit windows. A media crisis consultant, someone with a record of managing high-profile public agency fallouts, sat across from a row of uneasy, prideful faces, still unwilling to admit the situation had spiraled. He opened his laptop and presented a slide deck mapping the viral spread of the Bernard Jackson video, frame by frame annotated, each line of dialogue underlined in red. When he reached the final slide, he stopped and said, "Apologize before the Pentagon does." The statement was not meant to reassure, but to provoke. He knew well that once the clip resurfaced and the audio recording was leaked, the situation had moved beyond the reach of local media. It was no longer a debate about right or wrong, it had become a question of power. A soldier had been killed. A system had denied his identity, and now hundreds of veteran organizations were demanding a hearing. Every minute of silence was a step backward in managing public control. The issue, as he saw it, was no longer about salvaging the department's image. It was about keeping it from being placed on a collision course with the Department of Defense. A deputy director of personnel, seated in the corner of the room, exhaled through his teeth and replied, "We have nothing to apologize for. Everything is under review." That response made the communications advisor freeze, then quietly close his laptop, gather his documents, and say nothing further. He clearly understood the message just delivered. It was arrogance with no place left in reality, and he knew that if those seated in this room still believed things were under control, they would soon be removed from the board altogether. The meeting shooting ended without any formal resolution, but shortly after, an internal notice was issued through the emergency communication system. Effective immediately, all personnel under the department are prohibited from engaging with the press, giving interviews, or making personal statements on any social media platform under any circumstance. The memo contained only 2 brief paragraphs, did not cite reasons, and did not mention any specific incident, but everyone understood it was issued under mounting pressure from above, not from the public, but from the military. Unit supervisors were instructed to repeat the notice to their teams at the beginning of each shift. Some nodded, others exchanged silent glances. No one dared to ask further. That silence was no longer about compliance, but about apprehension. They understood that something larger was happening beyond their view, and the ban on media contact was not to protect officers, but to prevent any word that might accidentally confirm what the department was too afraid to write: that Bernard Jackson was a soldier, that he did not resist, and that the shooting could no longer be justified. Dalton Craig was not given a separate briefing, but he noticed the shift in how people acted around him. The nods became shorter, and the casual conversations during breaks abruptly ended. He saw a colleague quickly lock their phone screen the moment he entered the room. In the garage, a technician avoided eye contact while inspecting patrol vehicle number 218, the one assigned to Dalton. He still worked, still signed papers, and carried out patrols as ordered, but he had started to realize the storm was no longer out there. It had reached the station door. Only no one had yet decided who would be the first to be swept away. Bernard Jackson took his final breath early on the 7th morning after being admitted to the hospital. No one stood by his bed, no alarms went off, no calls for doctors. Only the pale light from the window fell across the white bed sheets as the heart monitor gradually slowed, then flatlined. When the nurse on duty entered for the last check, she didn't need to record any more vitals. Bernard's left hand remained clenched, fingers curled tightly as if holding on to something unseen, as though all the words left unsaid had solidified into form and refused to let go. The attending physician wrote the cold summary: cardiac arrest following deep coma, no neurological response. All records still bore the patient's code number. No real name, no rank, nothing corrected. Only one staff member placed a hand on Bernard's chest for a brief moment before covering his face, their eyes pausing on a small scar behind his left ear, a mark that in military medical circles was known as a survivor's trace. The patient file was sent to the archives without any family contact order. For a week, all traces of Bernard had been wiped from the civilian system. The hospital either didn't know or didn't want to know that the man who had just died was a U.S. Army major, recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal for Overseas Emergency Response, who had trained hundreds of young soldiers in survival tactics. When the seal on the bag of personal items was removed, the inventory listed 3 things: a wristwatch, a thin silver chain, and a small photo folded into quarters inside a leather wallet. The final photo Bernard took was printed on soft matte paper, its edges wrinkled from sweat and time. In it, he wore a full uniform, standing upright before the national flagpole during a ceremony at a southern training base, his face tilted skyward, eyes not fixed on the lens, but instead focused on the flag's peak, as if addressing something beyond rank, beyond title, beyond the silence often left unnamed by those in uniform. The light in the photo wasn't bright, but it was enough to highlight the silver threads along his collar. A copy of that photo had once been sent by Bernard to his mother with a handwritten note: "I'm still standing, don't worry." The paper was tucked into a Bible at her bedside, where she laid her hand each time she prayed. When news of her son's death reached her, not through official channels but from a former soldier present at the hospital, she retrieved the photo, placed it beside the framed portrait she had just selected, and sat silently before the altar for 4 hours without anyone daring to interrupt. At Bernard's former base, the officer in charge printed that photo in large format and pinned it to the board outside the training center. No memorial service was held, no speech delivered, no video allowed, But that morning, the entire unit stood at attention for 10 minutes. Not by order, not out of tradition, but because they all understood. Some deaths need no ceremony to become a milestone. And Bernard, by the way he lifted his chin in that photo, left behind a message that didn't need writing. That is, when a soldier falls on home soil, no one gets to call it a coincidence and stand still. The Department of Defense internal bulletin was issued at exactly 11 o'clock, distributed to all units within secure military channels, invisible to all civilian media platforms. The opening line did not name Bernard Jackson, show his image, or mention his rank, but the headline alone made every uniformed reader pause. Any violation of military personnel rights on U.S. soil shall be deemed a breach of national strategic integrity. No footnotes, no legal citations, no additional clauses needed. That's how the Pentagon strikes. Directly at the foundation, no detour. The document was 6 pages long, but its most crucial content fit into just 2 paragraphs, clearly stating that any act causing harm to military personnel, whether on the battlefield or American soil, would be treated as a direct threat to national defense infrastructure. Regardless of rank, profession, or temporary authority, the document read, any individual involved in acts of assault, violation, or causing severe consequences to unarmed military personnel will be subject to undisclosed transfer to military investigation. A corporate overlord might have wished to see the process, and Dalton Craig's name appeared at the bottom of the attached list, with no date, no annotations, and no specific reason. But anyone who had ever served understood this. Once a name appeared there would be no hearing, no time left to negotiate. He had entered a space where civilian law offered no protection, a space where honor and accountability no longer belonged to the regular courts. A copy of the list was sent directly to the Military Tactical Transfer Division, encrypted through 3 layers, accessible only by officers holding the rank of lieutenant general or higher. Those working within that system did not discuss or ask questions. They simply executed as they had been trained, to overlook no threat, whether it came from abroad or from within their ranks. At the police department where Dalton was stationed, no one was informed in advance. Internal notifications remained unchanged, shifts rotated as usual, and patrol maps were printed each morning as if nothing had altered. But a quiet shift had begun. Dalton's device access codes were disabled, his internal email was redirected, and 2 days prior, a group of 3 unfamiliar individuals had been granted clearance to enter the administrative wing without a stated reason. Dalton did not know. He still carried his weapon, still stepped out of the station as if the whole thing had passed like a wave of public outrage. But those in the system saw what he could not. A deputy shift commander noticed his name had vanished from the automatic timekeeping system, but said nothing. A female officer in surveillance received a report adjusting the priority monitoring zones and signed it without a change in expression. In law enforcement, silence was never due to ignorance. It was the result of knowing exactly what was coming. On the other side, in an unmarked office near the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Avery Monroe nodded upon receiving confirmation of the subject's location. He said nothing further, simply opened a file cabinet and placed one more folder into a drawer labeled Action Ordered, Non-Public. The room was so quiet that the soft thud of paper could be heard. That was the moment it became clear the story no longer belonged to public discourse. It had entered a space where no apology could reach. And Dalton, though he had seen nothing yet, was already within the crosshairs. That morning, the sky was a pale gray, as if even the weather was holding its breath. Dalton Craig had just stepped out of the shower, towel over his shoulder, and hadn't yet poured his first cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. It wasn't frantic or rushed like an impatient civilian press, but a single evenly spaced chime, as if programmed in advance. He adjusted his shirt, peeked through the curtain, and saw no one. When he opened the door, 4 men in plain clothes entered without waiting for an invitation. The lead man presented a military identification badge showing only the embossed logo of the Department of Defense and a deep blue seal. "Dalton Craig," the man said in a steady, low voice. "You are required to come with us. The arrest order has been authorized and does not require legal representation at this time." Dalton started to speak, but the man's eyes dissolved a question in his throat. He looked around. No weapons, no threats, but each advancing step wrapped in a command that didn't need repeating. His hand lowered, his foot stepped back, then stopped. The neighbors noticed nothing. The local news continued airing updates about traffic congestion and recommended staying indoors unless necessary. No one on the street saw Dalton leave his house because the back door had already been opened, and the black SUV had been parked at the curb for 3 minutes. As he entered the rear seat, the door locked automatically. The car bore no branding, no plates, its dark leather interior lined with embedded cameras and soundproofing that blocked all exterior noise. For 2 hours, no one spoke. Dalton stared through the glass, watching gas stations, street lamps, and road signs flash by, unable to gauge direction. His phone's GPS had been disabled the moment he stepped into the vehicle. Time and place began to blur, leaving only the sound of stifled breathing in the sealed cabin and his reflection dimly floating in the glass, a figure no longer tied to its origin. By the time the vehicle stopped, the sky had begun to turn. A steel gate opened without a sound, revealing layered fencing and guard posts, unmanned but monitored by rotating cameras. There were no unit insignias, no national flags, only concrete ground and 3 closed doors are behind a wide courtyard. They didn't take Dalton through the main entrance. A side corridor led underground, opened by fingerprint scan, with an AI voice confirming the escort's identity using a code the government had never disclosed publicly. The door opened, casting soft yellow light into a small room with a single chair, a steel table, and a 2-way mirror. Dalton was told to sit. The lead man spoke again, this time more curtly, more clearly. "You are not being held by civilian authorities. You have no right to press access, no attorney contact. You are being processed under the Department of Defense's special authority under the Homeland Security Strategic Clause." Dalton tried to object, but the expression on the man's face was no longer language, but the outline of a fate already drawn. They left the room, the doors sealed behind them, leaving Dalton beneath a white light that no longer cast his shadow on the floor. It had been absorbed, along with every privilege that once shielded him from consequence. But this time, there would be no shield. The door opened again after nearly 3 hours of silence. Dalton didn't know the exact time, but the light still shone directly into his face, making his eyes dry and sore. A man entered. Unlike the previous staff, this one wore a full military uniform, rows of medals gleaming on his left chest. He carried no files, no recorder. The first look he gave had already weighed every reason Dalton ever had for existing. The colonel did not sit right away. He stood still for a long while, arms crossed, eyes locked on the pale face across from him. No formalities, no guided questions. The first sentence he spoke was also the only one that introduced what was coming. "Do you know who he was?" Dalton looked up, pupils tightening on reflex, then quickly squinting, trying to retrieve some old trace of defiance in his voice. "Just some guy wearing the wrong uniform. A wannabe playing victim." Immediately the colonel turned and gestured, and without a single word more, 2 officers entered, one on each side of the chair, lifting Dalton clean off the floor in a single motion, pinning his back flat. One of them blindfolded him, the other slid leather gloves tight to the wrists. The sound of the palm cutting through the air and landing squarely on Dalton's chest hit like a slap of truth. He struggled, shouted a familiar string of slurs, words he had hurled at black men like Bernard without ever hearing them echoed back, but this time the words came out warped, like a joke crushed by the very space around him. They didn't react to what he said, they reacted to what he stood for. When he used the word savage for the 3rd time, the next strike didn't hit his chest, it landed between his ribs and lower stomach, precise, leaving no bruise. Dalton stammered, voice trembling. "Do I have the right to an attorney?" The question vanished into the air. The colonel finally sat down, both hands resting on the table, posture upright as if his spine were made of steel. "In here, that right doesn't exist under civilian law," he said, not loudly, but the echo in his tone made Dalton feel his heart fall out of his chest. "We are handling you under internal protocol. You are not a suspect, nor a criminal under investigation. You are a confirmed strategic threat, and threats do not need attorneys." Dalton gasped, sweat breaking along his forehead and spine. "I'm a cop. I'm not a terrorist." The colonel raised his head, gaze direct. "You shot a military major on this soil, then mocked him with the kind of language only a servant of power knows by instinct. You're not a terrorist, but you are the reason the military must now defend itself." The light cut off for 2 seconds, then came back on. When it returned, the colonel was gone. Dalton was once again lifted from the steel chair, dragged from the room by the same legs that had never trembled when stepping on someone's neck. But this time the floor was cold and firm. No one looked up, and no camera signaled a story would make headlines. This place didn't need the media. It only needed an end. And an end, as the man had said, never needs a voice. It comes by order, and is carried out the moment the back of the guilty vanishes from the corridor. The room had no windows, no echo of footsteps from the hallway. Dalton was held inside a concrete box as cold as a vault for erased memories. The Level 4 security detention zone had no sense of day or night, only the constant white light that illuminated every flawless inch of the wall, every breath filtered by an air control system embedded in the ceiling. All requests were submitted through a signal button, but no answers ever came. Nothing was returned. Dalton had tried calling a lawyer, had asked to see a human rights officer, had pleaded for a phone call to his wife. Not a single response made it past the 10-centimeter thick steel door separating him from the rest of the world he once thought belonged to him. This place did not exist on any administrative map, was not under police jurisdiction, nor within the reach of any civil court. It was a zone of special oversight, an internal arm of enforcement accessible only by military authority and direct orders from the Pentagon. In a building 2 corridors away, a special panel of 7 people was holding a closed session. All wore military uniforms, none bore rank insignia. The room was sealed with triple-layer biometric locks and the highest level of anti-surveillance systems. Among the 7, 3 had once served alongside Bernard Jackson during operations in the Middle East. They did not speak much, but each nod, each shared glance was enough to reopen 6 months' worth of sealed files without needing any formal criminal charges. One man said quietly, "He held on for 6 days. Not to live, but to make sure we saw the choice." The only woman on the council, Lieutenant General Fiona Calhoun, placed a file on the table. "We are facing a situation with no precedent, but I don't need precedent to know what's right." She opened the first page. A photo of Bernard in full uniform, head raised under the flagpole, his right hand over his chest badge, dried blood visible beneath his sleeve. "This man is the reason many of us are still alive. That man shot him, then laughed, and called him a word that makes me want to smash every domestic officer training system we've ever built." Another member spoke, short in stature, voice low and even, not angry but cold enough to chill the room. "I led Operation Phoenix with Mr. Jackson. He never fired unless cornered. He faced a domestic cop and still didn't resist. That means he believed in the law. So the question isn't whether we deal with Dalton. It's whether we let that belief be shot dead a second time." No vote was needed. The decision was already made. But more important was how it would be carried out. One person flipped to the second to last page in the file, which included a transcript from the leaked video. "I knew he was military, but he knelt like a savage, so I took him out before he could stand." That statement no longer belonged in the realm of ethics. It was a clear confession that the motive had moved beyond the reach of legal control, and when an action breaches the boundaries of both civilian and military law, there remains only one applicable framework: national strategic order. Bernard was not just an individual. He was a symbol of faith in a system already trembling, and Dalton, with a single bullet and a smirk, had written his name onto a verdict that could not be erased. The meeting ended without a show of hands. 6 people stood. The last remained seated for a moment longer, staring once more at Bernard's photograph, then folded the file the way one might fold a flag over a comrade's coffin. The attorney sent by Dalton's family stood outside the inner checkpoint for nearly 7 hours, receiving nothing but a printed notice. Request denied. Insufficient clearance to represent military honor. He had never seen such a phrase in an official document, but it was stamped with the eagle's claw gripping a silver shield, used only for emergency internal orders under national security. No further explanation was given. No one came to meet him. A young soldier at the gate, hand resting on his weapon per protocol, simply said, "Please clear the area. Outside civilian jurisdiction." Inside a sealed conference room lined with magnetic steel, the military council had moved into the review phase, but this time not to hear a defense. They were reviewing all statements, evidence, audio recordings, and biometric data retrieved from Bernard's on-body sensors the day of the shooting. The data showed his vitals were completely stable in the 60 seconds before the shot, with no signs of stress or physical threat, meaning he had not resisted or exhibited aggressive behavior. The unedited video confirmed Bernard was still seated in his vehicle when forcibly removed. At the moment of the gunshot, his heart rate plummeted almost instantly following impact. Audio analysis showed there had been no formal warning from Dalton before firing, even though they stood less than 2 meters apart. A single question was capitalized, bolded, and placed in the center of the internal memo like a command. If he knew he was an officer, why did he pull the trigger? One council member flipped through Bernard's military ID. Original card, fingerprints intact, edged with dried blood. It had been found in his hand, bent but not dropped, meaning Dalton had seen it, or worse, ignored it. A young colonel on the council spoke in a dry tone. "The problem isn't that he didn't know. It's that he knew and didn't care." Another voice added, quieter, "If he saw the military ID and still fired, that action is no longer a misjudgment, it's a message, a choice." Next to them sat the transcript of Dalton's words. "I knew he was military, but he knelt like a savage." That statement no longer fits within misconduct. It fell into the darkest category of all, one that dismantles military honor from within. Racial insult, degradation of officer status, and the incitement of hatred through violence. A supplemental file from the Department of Defense stated clearly, in all circumstances, military officers in uniform are exempt from civilian interrogation unless a valid arrest warrant is issued. That meant Dalton's actions were not only unlawful but a legal overreach. He had no right to pull Bernard from the vehicle, no authority to demand a search, and no justification for using force. Every act thereafter was an escalating violation that could not be defended, and there was no debate left. The council required no more evidence. What remained was deciding how to respond, to uphold the system Bernard had once believed in. An officer who had survived a campaign with Bernard in Kandahar spoke in a low voice. "This is not about revenge, but if we let this go unanswered, next time no one will dare wear the uniform in public." The meeting ended with a single knock on the table. Then everyone stood as if it were the final salute to Bernard Jackson. Not with music, not with flags, but with cold, unwavering consensus. Dalton Craig's personnel file was not publicly accessible, but it took less than an hour for a senior Department of Defense investigator to gain internal access to his full service history and records of policy violations. 3 formal complaints were documented, all involving the use of excessive force. 2 occurred while Craig served in eastern New Brighton, an area previously involved in a class-action lawsuit over systemic racism in law enforcement. The 3rd was a scuffle at a checkpoint where the victim, a black teenager, had been detained for more than 4 hours simply for driving without headlights. An internal note read, "Craig was recommended for reassignment to a more disciplined unit to monitor conduct. That decision was never approved." The reason remained vague, with only a handwritten note in the margin, "Old contact, monitor closely." That line was a smudge of ink no one wanted to claim responsibility for. The surprise wasn't that Craig had a record. It was that he always got away, as if someone had deliberately helped him slip through each layer of review without triggering a full internal investigation capable of pulling his badge. When a security officer pulled audio logs from patrol channels within 30 days before the shooting, a suspicious recording surfaced, an exchange between Craig and a fellow officer 2 days before the incident. In it, Craig's gravelly voice crackled through the radio. "You see the way they look at me? Like, I owe them this badge. Let's see who dares next time." The statement wasn't a direct threat, but the tone, combined with the sneer in his voice, revealed something deeper. Personal resentment morphing into systemic contempt. The investigator noted, "Dalton does not simply exhibit violent tendencies. He harbors disdain for the military's honor structure and the law itself. He didn't shoot out of panic. He shot to prove something, that in his territory even those in uniform had to bow like everyone else." A psychological assessment from the inquiry team described him as having an inflated self-humor and a hyperfixation on power beyond normative thresholds. He perceives the badge as a license to enforce order through personal bias. This explained why Bernard, who posed no threat, became the silent target of a single, unannounced shot. There was no provocation. Just a moment where one man's internal line between right and wrong collapsed in the hand holding the gun. The case file grew by nearly 30 pages, including copies of investigative reports never submitted to the state level. These sat dormant in the system, labeled internally resolved, never reviewed by external oversight. It was the kind of evasion that didn't need denial, just silence. And if not for Bernard, these files would have remained buried in a folder mockingly titled Force Stability. The lead investigator paused when reaching the final report, written by a junior officer 3 years prior. Dalton Craig should not continue in law enforcement without independent psychiatric clearance, high risk of power abuse. The report was returned unapproved, with no reason cited. The author was later reassigned. Dalton stayed and kept patrolling. But this time he hadn't just targeted a civilian. He had fired at a U.S. Army major. And this time the very system he thought would keep shielding him was peeling back its armor, line by line. Inside a military hall located deep in a restricted zone, the hearing began at 9 a.m., attended by Pentagon officials, the Department of Defense, and a select group of veterans who had served alongside Bernard Jackson. For the first time in history, a police chief from a mid-size American city was summoned to testify before a federal military council, not as an honorary guest, but as a liable party. Chief Ray Hanley, long known for his politically predictable stability, walked into an unfamiliar space lined with combat uniforms and the unblinking stares of senior officers piercing through his collar. The clerk read aloud the initial charge. The individual summoned to today's special hearing must respond to questions regarding internal control mechanisms over civilian armed forces following the incident that resulted in the death of Major Bernard Jackson, a commissioned officer on reserve duty. Hanley tried to maintain composure, but his hand kept moving, tapping lightly on the microphone as if testing his breath. When asked to explain the background checks, behavior evaluations, and oversight of Dalton Craig, he replied, "Craig's file was reviewed like any other officer. There were no violations warranting suspension." The answer caused the entire row of military advisors to shift at once, like an unspoken signal. Lieutenant General Avery Monroe tilted his head, tapping a finger against the table. "Did you read all internal warnings?" Hanley swallowed, nodding slightly. "I did," he said softly, "but under local law the behavior didn't reach the threshold for formal notice." That answer went unrecorded, because immediately after it was buried in the cold silence of military proceedings, a kind of silence that renders any defense irrelevant. In another room, Dalton was escorted from isolation to face a secondary inquiry. The light in the room illuminated only the steel table, the interrogation chair, and his lowered face. When asked one final time why he shot Bernard, the only defense Dalton could mutter, hoarse and cracking, was, "I felt threatened." An officer responded instantly, voice sharp as falling steel. He was seated in a vehicle, in uniform, presenting a military ID. "So what made you feel threatened? The flag on his chest or the color of his skin?" Dalton said nothing. He did not look up. From a ceiling mount camera, the footage streamed to the analysis room with near-Nero delay. A team of technicians sat before a large screen, cross-referencing every detail of his statement against earlier records. Facial tension, vocal strain, irregular breathing, every indicator pointed to the same conclusion. Dalton was lying. The compiled data from the 40-minute session was sent directly to the Special Staff Command of the Department of Defense. In a closed meeting room, Lieutenant General Munro addressed the other members. "No further hearings are needed. We've heard enough." The only person who had remained silent throughout the meeting was Colonel Raquel Haynes, who had served with Bernard through 4 deployments. She stood only when the meeting concluded, eyes fixed on the doorway as if awaiting something that didn't need to be said. A decision had been made, even if not yet announced. And outside, in the waiting corridor, a group of veterans stood in formation, holding no flags, no banners, offering no words. They simply stood, quietly, like a wall of honor requiring no justification. Because to them, what Bernard left behind was not a name in a file, it was the reason justice could no longer afford to wait. The internal satellite map, extracted directly from the military vehicle monitoring system, clearly displayed Bernard Jackson's route within the 10-minute window before and after the incident. From the 3-dimensional simulation on the large screen, the SUV bearing military plates remained stationary at the north curb of Lincoln Heights. GPS data not only confirmed the vehicle's exact location, but also revealed the operational status of its internal systems. The engine was idling, the gear shift was in P, and, most crucially, the driver's seat belt was still fastened. Lieutenant Colandero, the officer in charge of technical analysis, stared at the motion sequence data, then stepped back from the screen. His eyes scanned the heat map and the final internal camera frame. Bernard remained in place. No struggle, no sign of exiting the seat, no attack. Everything aligned with the moment of the gunshot. He removed his headset, stepped out of the secondary command post and threw the report binder onto the duty commander's desk. He didn't move an inch. He was shot while still buckled in. The words echoed through the already frigid room, making everyone inside hold their breath. Lieutenant Colonel Eliza Mendez, tasked with transferring data to the investigative council, turned her chair and asked in a dry voice, "Final confirmation? No movement?" Darrow nodded, pointing to the screen. "The window from 2:22 p.m. to ambulance arrival is completely void of motion. All sensors indicate the driver's seat remained stationary, not even half an inch of shift. The seat belt was only unlatched by medical personnel. A rapid response report was printed and stamped. Urgent. It stated clearly, no resistance or exit attempt from Major Bernard Jackson. The driver's seat position is unchanged. Seat belt still fastened at the moment the bullet pierced the window. Below the confirmation signature, the author had handwritten a note. Enforcement situation lacked elements of self-defense. That red ink sentence became the key to overturning the entire police narrative once constructed. That same afternoon, the report was delivered to 2 military advisors preparing documentation for the Secretary of Defense. One of them, General Darrell Quinn, had been present at the scene moments after the incident. He had quietly placed his hand on the dried blood still staining the seat. Now, seated in the briefing room with the report in his lap, he held the page edges as if it might vanish if released. He hadn't even pulled his ID, he said softly. He had just opened his wallet. No one responded, but everyone lowered their heads. The evidence was too clear. The words in the report left no room for doubt or justification. More importantly, they pushed the responsibility out of the fog of interpretive judgment and placed it squarely within a single boundary: premeditated murder during the execution of duty. There was no longer space to speak of misunderstanding or perceived threat. In the hallway outside the hearing room, a veteran leaned against the wall, holding an old photo of himself and Bernard in Iraq, both smiling in a haze of sand and dust. He said nothing, only turned the photo over, where a line had been scrawled in messy handwriting, "If one day I die because of my skin color and not this flag, do not forgive." And someone, today, had read it. The handwritten memo was on paper bearing the Central Command letterhead, though it carried no specific date. The writer was a retired general who had once overseen joint forces in the Middle East, now serving as an advisor in matters concerning military honor. The black-inked lines, slightly shaky and slant, carried words sharp as blades. Every bullet fired at a soldier is a bullet fired at discipline. Every excuse offered is a shard embedded in the honor of the entire armed force. And each time we stay silent is when we pull the trigger on the last thread of public trust in ourselves. The letter was delivered directly to the Secretary of Defense, bypassing all formal screening. It was not part of the official process, yet it spread quickly, like an unspoken directive. Everyone who read it understood this case could no longer be filed under local controversy. This time, the issue was the structure of the entire institution. Meanwhile, as military rooms rushed to prepare for internal restructuring, the national media entered a strange silence. From the morning news to major online outlets, not a single line mentioned the name Bernard Jackson or the video that had shaken the public days prior. Articles previously drafted were pulled, editors declined comment, and police department spokespeople repeated the same meaningless phrase, "We are in the process of verification." Several independent journalists tried to speak out, only to receive warning letters from their parent media companies. One reporter had their contract terminated just hours after asking a public question about the scene access protocol during the latest press conference. Every mainstream channel seemed to shut down at once, leaving behind a hollow silence where explosive information should have been. But silence did not mean control. A French-language paper in Europe, La Voix de l'Ombre, unexpectedly published a full report early in the morning, local time. The article detailed the entire chain of events, from the moment Bernard was forced to pull over to the time Dalton Craig was taken into custody. More than that, they held the audio confession and a video excerpt never before released, capturing the moment Bernard collapsed, his hand still gripping a blood-marked military ID. The international reaction was swift. Major newspapers in Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia translated the report and added analyses on abuse of authority within the U.S. policing system. A representative from the International Veterans Organization spoke on French television. "If a nation allows its soldiers to die in silence on home soil, who will dare wear that uniform into battle again?" Across the ocean, when the White House Communications Office updated its report, a presidential aide typed just 3 words into the response field. They went first. No one needed to ask who they were, and no one believed the information war was still under government control. Inside a small room, buried in a facility with no flag displayed, Lieutenant Colonel Elisa Mendez read the English translation of the article, her eyes resting on the final line. "Justice needs no borders, because injustice knows how to dig its own grave in the heart of every empire." She folded the paper, looked up, and told the soldier at the door, "Notify internal channels. Phase 2 begins tonight." The Pentagon did not hold a press conference. No spokesperson was appointed. No invitations were sent to the media, but by mid-morning, an internal memorandum stamped "Urgent, no delay" was circulated among key military commanders of the United States Armed Forces. Citing Article 7, Section 4 of the National Defense Code, it read, "Any act causing harm or death to a United States service member while on duty, regardless of whether it originates from civilian or other forces, may be deemed a tactical hostile action and subject to the highest level of disciplinary response." No more ambiguity, no more debate over jurisdiction or blurred lines of civilian authority. The document served as an implicit verdict. The incident was no longer an operational misstep, but an assault on national military infrastructure. When a field-grade officer, Major Bernard Jackson, was shot while in uniform assisting a civilian, it ceased to be about race, it became about the system. More More notably, the document explicitly stated, the perpetrator's non-military status does not diminish the strategic threat. On the contrary, an armed individual within local law enforcement using authority to suppress and kill a senior military officer may be considered tantamount to a breach of national security. The language left no room for leniency. It referred to the act as a domestic assassination and a wound to the trust between the military and the civilian populace. The Military Advisory Council, composed of former generals and national defense scholars, concurred that if left unaddressed, such precedents could fracture the entire chain of interagency command and place the U.S. military in a reactive position within its borders. According to this document, Dalton Craig was no longer viewed as a civilian involved in a criminal case. He was classified as tactical threat scenario, and, like a blade dropped squarely in the center of the conference table, a red-inked line along the document's margin made it clear, not to be tried under state law. Full jurisdiction of investigation, detention, and prosecution under military executive authority. This shift didn't just change the course of Dalton's case. It sent silent tremors through the entire federal law enforcement command. A senior official at Homeland Security withdrew from meetings, citing conflicts with classified duties, while an FBI legal advisor refused to represent him if the case stayed under military control. From then on, Dalton vanished from civilian criminal databases, with no trial dates, no external counsel. Inside the secure facility, Dalton felt the walls close in. Interrogations had shifted from fact-finding to threat assessment. His name disappeared from records, replaced by Subject D. Each echoing step down the concrete halls reminded him he was a small part, crushed by a relentless machine beyond his understanding. That night, in a windowless room deep within the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Avery Monroe led a closed-door session lasting over 3 hours. The sole agenda, does Article 7 justify a death sentence? The military map was unfurled. A detention site circled in red, no debate needed, only a final order awaited. The air was thick with unspoken weight, as a national security advisor warned. Invoking Article 7 here sets an unprecedented precedent. Military trial of a civilian without federal court oversight. Do you grasp the political fallout? Monroe, steady as steel, toyed with a pen before piercing silence with a chilling question. How many more must die before this becomes precedent? He demanded. Describe Bernard Jackson's final moments. The answer was cold and clear. Seatbelt fastened, hands on the wheel, military ID in hand, weapon untouched. Then why label him a threat? The room fell silent as all political avenues closed. Any defense was a mere veneer over a grinding, inevitable process. Rising, Monroe's voice resonated softly but firmly. If this is a dangerous precedent, let it be recorded. But no precedent is darker than allowing a cop to kill a soldier without hesitation. Without another word, he left the room, leaving the pen beside the sealed report. A quieter general confirmed, "No vote needed, we all know." A final nod from Internal Affairs sealed the moment. In the halls, a single thought echoed. Justice must not be late, not this time. Below, a personnel officer received the terse update. Subject D, escalate to terminal protocol. Without question, he keyed in the command, locked the console, and glanced once more at the base map. The red dot marking Dalton's detention blinked steadily. No names were spoken, but all understood. The order was given. This time, the military would deliver the final verdict. Dalton was led into a nameless room, buried deep underground, where artificial light shone down like surveillance on every breath. His chair was bolted in the center of a black-painted iron circle, surrounded by 7 others. There was no judge's bench, no national flag, no lawyers or reporters. Only 7 officers, each bearing a rank heavy enough to decide the course of a man's entire career. Dalton was not handcuffed, but his eyes moved across them as if counting down his minutes. No introductions were made, no formal start declared. An older man, with scratched silver medals across his chest, leaned forward and spoke slowly, his voice like stone. "We're not here to ask what you think. We're here to see if you can still look straight at what you've done." Dalton pressed his lips together, hands on his thighs, clenching and releasing, unsure how to sit in a room that offered no place for defense. The first to stand was a lieutenant general from the ground forces, eyes seasoned by enough campaigns to smell lies before they were spoken. He placed a photo on the table, blurry, aged, showing a black soldier lying on the roadside, torn uniform, blood trailing from shoulder to waist. That year, my brother-in-arms was tossed aside like trash. The press said he was holding a suspicious object. Later, we found internal radio footage. It was a broken badge. Without pause, the second man spoke. A retired naval colonel, his voice dry like winter waves crashing on a ship's deck. My nephew, an airman, had his nose shattered for jogging after shift. Police said he disobeyed orders. 17 skull fragments later, he never saw the sky again. He looked directly at Dalton. But you pulled the trigger, and you knew who he was. Dalton didn't look up. No one forced him. No one asked for tears. Each story landed like a chisel striking the stone seat beneath his name. A logistics officer recounted a colleague whose face was slammed against a windshield after calling police for roadside help. A field nurse spoke of her husband, in uniform, handcuffed in the street because his skin was the wrong shade. A general brought it home. The list of the dead keeps growing, but the list of the accountable stays blank. Finally, the presiding officer asked, "Do you have anything to say?" Dalton raised his head. His voice did not tremble or tighten, but it came out faint, like speaking through smoke. "I didn't think the system would come this far." Silence stretched tight. Then, from the chair on the right, a female voice cut through, not loud, but sharp enough to slice the air. "It's not the system, it's an honor." Dalton turned, his eyes flickering for the first time. The woman wore a brigadier general's stars, silver streaks at her temples, her spine unyielding. She drew out an old ID card, Bernard Jackson's military badge, now sealed behind thin glass. The bloodstain faded to brown. She laid it on the table, directly before Dalton. "You saw this badge. You pretended not to, because his skin wasn't your skin, because you thought the power in your gun outweighed the title on his chest." No one objected. No one interrupted. One council member jotted notes into the file, then slid it leftward. The person to the left didn't read. It had been agreed beforehand. This hearing wasn't to determine guilt. The evidence already spoke. This was the final word, not for Dalton, but for the record. The silence that followed was a sentence heavier than any indictment. Dalton bowed his head again, this time longer. He knew every door had closed. No miracle would come from civilian law. All he had left, if anything, was to avoid those faces. But even his gaze could no longer hide the truth that everyone now understood. He hadn't just killed a man. He had fired upon a symbol he was sworn to defend. In the hallway, a young officer waited for a signal from inside. When the door opened, he received a sealed envelope bearing only one line: enact decision under Article 7, military executive level. He asked no questions. Orders required no explanation. The corridor remained long and still, but something inside had shifted, not because of Dalton, but because they refused to let it happen again. Not for revenge, but for honor this time, held to its true meaning. An unreleased video clip was discovered on the hard drive of an old camera positioned in the rear hallway of the security checkpoint at Fort Halley Military Base. The camera angle was tilted, no zoom, no color correction, just Bernard Jackson standing in the center of the frame, his face turned slightly, voice low but layered with years of restrained questioning. Can anyone honestly believe that a black officer is still not trusted in his own country? No answer followed. But in the next few seconds, he walked toward the door, leaving behind glances that dodged like fractures in a wall never fully sealed. The 2-minute clip was never released to any press system. It was archived as evidence, not of a crime, but of premonition. News of Bernard's death did not come through an official call. It passed through the hands of a former comrade, reaching his mother, Luana Jackson, on a grim morning in the town of Whitley, where she had raised the flag every week until the day it was lowered to half-mast, never to rise again. 1 week later, a military representative arrived at her home with a velvet-lined wooden box containing a posthumous Medal of Honor. She did not open the box, simply turned it upside down on the table, looked up and said in a voice drained of tone, I don't need grief in gold." The officer stood still, nodded gently, and turned away. In the internal record book, a single line was written: "Family declined to accept commemorative honor." In a closed hearing of the Supreme Disciplinary Council, consisting of representatives from the three main military branches, a female officer stood, her hair neatly tied back, uniform pressed down to every button. Her voice was not loud, not harsh, but each word dropped with the weight of a considered verdict. "We do not execute for vengeance. We act for discipline, as a matter of survival." No one objected, no one interjected. Every nod was a silent oath that did not need repeating. In the adjacent room, military legal personnel finalized the file, the last resolution stamped in red. "Execute under Article 7 Defense Code using exceptional measures, unanimously approved by the Council. No abstentions, no objections. A 7-0 decision." This ruling was not about one man, but about a structure that must stand upright to survive an era when trust shatters like old glass. On the military's internal network, there was no official announcement. Only one line of text sent across the system, simple and direct. Starting December 19th, any public threat to the life of a U.S. officer, regardless of rank or background, will be handled under wartime protocol. Below that, no likes, no comments. But internal shares surged within 2 hours. The system automatically redistributed the statement to more than 144 military facilities across 5 states. In a training class for recruits, the instructor, a veteran who had once served alongside Bernard, played the trimmed clip, leaving only the question, "Can anyone honestly believe?" He turned off the projector, faced the class, and no explanation was needed. The room remained silent for nearly a minute. One student raised a hand, asked, "What discipline are we supposed to learn from this?" The instructor replied, "No one wearing the uniform should ever be suspected more because of their skin. And if anyone still believes otherwise, we're not worthy of calling ourselves comrades." That afternoon, Bernard Jackson was laid to rest at the National Cemetery, with no reporters, no television crews. The ceremony proceeded in silence, marked only by the synchronized steps of the honor guard and a lone bugle's echo in the distance. The flag draped over his casket was folded, but not returned home. It was preserved in a glass chamber, beneath an inscription: "Officer Bernard Jackson, not fallen by enemy hand." Besides the case, a printed note quoted him directly: "Honor does not lie in medals. It lies in how you stand when the world turns its back." That day, thousands of social media accounts reposted the phrase, "Justice is not optional." No one needed to explain its origin. No one had to say his name again, because it had moved beyond the bounds of a mistaken shooting. It had become proof that what was once treated as normal, silence, concealment, and discrimination, would no longer be forgiven, and that this time the survival of an institution depended not on denial, but on the courage to confront. The system did not change because of one death, but from that day forward, no one dared pull the trigger upon seeing a military ID held up through a window. And if anyone still did, they would know, this time there would be no next time. Dalton was taken away at night, his hands restrained by tactical fabric cuffs, head lowered between 2 soldiers in field gear with no insignia. The vehicle ran dark, leaving the Eastern Auxiliary Military Base at 3:17 a.m., passing through 4 checkpoints without presenting a single document. All electronic devices within a 300-meter radius of the transfer corridor were disabled. No reports, no travel logs, no receiving unit. It was known as a cold transfer, a procedure reserved for actions documented in classified files, where transparency was not a requirement for security, but a threat to it. The room Dalton was brought into measured 15 square meters, soundproofed with industrial materials, no windows, no cameras. Inside was a single metal chair bolted to the floor, an electronic trigger beneath the feet, and a small wooden table with no drawers, placed 2 steps away. He was strapped into the chair, the cuffs tightening around his wrists, a band across his forehead to keep his head upright. No charges were read, and no verdict was announced. One of the 3 people in the room placed a sealed document on the table, opened it, and signed the last line, without a name. The pen was left on top. The document was burned immediately afterward. Dalton looked up, eyes trembling as they scanned the room. "I didn't think I'd be the first," he mumbled, barely audible. The man standing before him, tall, silver-haired, voice steady and clear, replied, "No, you're just the last one who never faced judgment." No one nodded or disagreed. They performed their duty the way one wipes away the final stain before returning a room to history. The order was carried out within 48 hours of the decision. The exact time was never recorded in any system. The officer in charge simply wrote one short line in a thick, leather-bound notebook. Order 72 executed successfully. End. No names, no case numbers, just a round red stamp, slightly smudged with sweat, pressed into the bottom corner of the page. At the base, the lights came back on at 6 a.m. The Level 4 detention facility was returned to an empty state, no questions asked, no questions permitted. The operation team was reassigned without explanation. All equipment used during the process was dismantled and destroyed under an internal classified protocol, including the chair, the table, and the soundproof materials. Elsewhere, 162 miles away, Dalton's personnel file was closed in the military database. The only note on the update read, "Status, no longer subject to processing." When local journalists attempted to trace his identity, they received a brief statement. "This case is beyond civil jurisdiction." All records of his time as a city police officer also quietly disappeared from public archives. The police chief who signed his hiring contract filed for early retirement 12 days after receiving a call from the Pentagon. No transcript, no confirmation letter. At the military cemetery where Bernard was buried, a small stone was placed beneath the southern tree line, outside the visitor area. On it was engraved a quiet message, a death acknowledged as justice when life had once been denied. No one claimed to have placed it, no one visited it, but those who knew understood that justice is not built from words. It is etched through decisive acts, needing no announcement, yet remembered forever. Within 3 days of the order's execution, military training programs at 14 units received updated documentation. The first line, under Emergency Personnel Protocol, stated clearly, "Misidentifying a soldier is not a system flaw. It is a sign that someone wears the uniform without understanding its weight." Dalton vanished from history as if he never existed, but every step he took, every word he spoke, and every action he made left behind irreversible consequences. From now on, anyone who believes power grants immunity will have to remember that trial. Quiet, but real. Justice, in its quietest form, does not need to be declared to the crowd. It must be delivered with full severity, even when no one sees it, to ensure no one dares repeat the old wrong with the old smirk over a death they assumed would be forgotten. Bernard Jackson is not a name to memorial. He is the full stop at the end of a long sentence of tolerance that once let silence reign, and the last thing Dalton heard was not a verdict, but the silence of a room that no longer forgave. 1 week after Order 72 was executed, the surface of civil institutions began to shift. Several senior officials in the Department of Justice and the Office of Federal Security Coordination submitted resignation letters, citing overly rigid implementation, lack of humanitarian consideration, and absence of civilian oversight. Domestic media reported the situation with a neutral tone, using phrases like strategic disagreement on response level, but those who had participated in the emergency meetings knew the truth. They were not objecting to Dalton's death, they were objecting to not being informed before it happened. Within the military, however, a short letter circulated through the secure internal network. The writer did not sign a name, only the title. Drill Sergeant, 82nd Division. The letter read, "We don't ask for privileges. We don't expect priority. But if the badge on our chest is to be treated like a worthless patch of cloth, then say it now, because we are soldiers, not living targets for someone else's itchy trigger finger. If a commissioned officer can be killed inside his car, in broad daylight, on the very land he served, by a man once allowed to wear the uniform of law enforcement, then military honor either needs to be rewritten or protected at all costs. The letter was never officially published, yet within 3 days it appeared in internal training sessions, was quoted during a televised speech by a Midwest training commander, and quietly posted on dining hall bulletin boards in more than 32 military installations nationwide. No one was disciplined for it. While debates about the boundary between military and civilian police authority simmered, a wave of remembrance for Bernard spread across social media. It was not launched by political groups but came from personal accounts, mostly veterans, officer cadets, and young people enrolled in service programs. They did not chant slogans or organize marches, but posted short clips: Bernard in uniform, Bernard at his wedding, Bernard walking his dog in the park, or standing by the street reading a newspaper. The accompanying text was simple: the last one who earned it with blood. Some international news outlets translated it as the last one who earned it without compromise. At a small park near the site of the incident, the stone bench where Bernard used to sit every morning now had a small wooden plaque fastened to its base. The board was unpainted, carved only with the words, "This is where he came to read, not to die." The plaque belonged to no construction project, had no serial code, and no one claimed to have made it. Although local enforcement once tried to remove it, after it was reattached several times overnight, they stopped bringing it up. Children in the area called it Uncle Bernard's bench. Every afternoon, someone would leave a fresh newspaper on the seat, neatly placed, like an unwritten ritual. The echo of his death did not end in policy debates. It seeped into how people looked at the uniform they put on each day. In an officer training class, the instructor spoke slowly, not reading from notes. Whenever someone asks why we must remember the ID numbers of our comrades, I say this: because someday we may have to prove they existed, that they lived, and that they were betrayed right where they were supposed to be safest. That line was quoted again and again in morning news segments, in oath-taking ceremonies, and on posters pinned beside the entrance of the academy. In a remote section of command headquarters, a group quietly began reviewing all past cases involving police action against service members from the past 20 years. No order had been given, no directive from above, but the officers called it the honor buffer. Each name, each note was reread, cross-checked it against military codes to ensure Bernard Jackson would not become the first symbol simply because he was the last victim. No one wanted a single death to carry the burden of cleaning up 3 decades of silence. And so, each morning when cadets lined up for roll call before training, the command phrase was updated. It used to end with the name of the unit. Now, they added one more line: honor is blood, hold it with every breath. Not everyone understood it immediately, but they were told to repeat it without explanation, because sometimes a name like Bernard endures longer than medals, longer than policies, for only one reason: no one dares forget he once sat there, reading, breathing, living as a soldier, until someone decided his skin color could decide the worth of all that. That morning, the small gate of the house at the end of Clayton Street creaked open as the military SUV came to a halt. No sirens, no flags, no ceremonial unit. Just a soldier in a neatly pressed uniform, holding his cap firmly against his chest, stepped up the porch and stood still before the woman who had been sitting there since early dawn. No introductions were given, no documents exchanged. The soldier bowed his head and remained there for exactly 3 minutes, then quietly walked away. That was how the military chose to apologize, not through statements, not through medals, but by the presence of someone who understood how to bow before what no ceremony could repair. Mrs. J. Exon did not ask for the messenger's name, his rank, or the unit he represented. She simply lifted the now cold teacup, set it down, and looked up. Her voice was neither trembling nor bitter. "I will not forgive, but I know he did not die in silence." The soldier gave no reply, only saluted once more before leaving the house that once displayed many photos of her son in uniform, now keeping only one: Bernard standing beneath a flagpole, head held high, sunlight cutting across the brim of his cap. At the same time, nearly 1,000 miles away, A nameless ceremony was held on the grounds of the Federal Military Training Academy. There were no cameras, no honorary guests, no lengthy speeches. Lecture Hall 5 was renamed Jackson Hall, but no statues were erected, no portraits hung, no artifacts displayed. On the coarse brick wall of the main hallway, a single carved line read, "Discipline begins with justice, not color." Few cadets stopped to read it, but from that day forward, none passed it without adjusting their stance. Some straightened up, others paused half a second reflexively, then moved on. According to official records, Bernard Jackson was listed as a major who died in the line of duty while upholding organizational principles. No specific circumstances were noted, and no mention of the shooter's name was made. Some military scholars argued that this preserved his dignity and prevented ongoing legal controversy. But in post-conflict ethics courses, his name was cited as a symbol that forced a redefinition of discipline. No longer blind obedience, mere rules on paper, but the act of choosing what is right, even when all authority tells you to remain silent. A group of young instructors proposed including his name in the official ethics curriculum. Initially rejected to avoid politicizing the content, the idea gained traction after a confidential survey of over 300 active service members. 83% said that if they could go back to the moment Bernard was pulled over, they wished they had been assigned that shift instead of Dalton. Not to save Bernard, but so they wouldn't have to live with knowing they stood on the same side as the one who pulled the trigger. On veterans forums, a trending topic titled "Morning Briefing Chair" drew hundreds of messages daily. Stories surfaced of officers humiliated because of their skin, of soldiers leaving the service because they couldn't bear the silence, and of how Bernard died, not resisting, not fleeing, just sitting there, breathing like a lawful citizen. He didn't say a word, but that doesn't mean silence. That comment remained pinned at the top of every post, never deleted, never replaced. Within the military's internal circles, a senior advisory group proposed creating a watchdog unit for abuses against unarmed service members, regardless of rank. Though not yet approved, the memorandum emphasized its urgency. Some opposed it, arguing it could undermine the command structure. One colonel countered during a meeting, "Any structure that allows a soldier to be shot while still buckled in deserves to collapse." The room fell silent. No transcript captured those words, but everyone remembered them. At the National Cemetery where Bernard was buried, his headstone bore no label of hero, no flowery inscription. It read simply, "Bernard Jackson, Major, date of birth, date of death," but people began to leave folded newspapers there, just as he used to read each morning. Some left small flags, others placed old photographs. Once a boy about 10 was brought by his father, stood still before the stone and softly asked, "Did he get shot for doing something wrong, Dad?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just tightened his grip on the child's hand, then said slowly, "Because someone thought he was wrong for daring to live right." Since then, no one dared overlook the small things. A gesture, a glance, a traffic stop. Because every system, no matter how complex, can crack at its weakest point. And if someone, like Bernard, could lose his life in silence, then everyone who remains must make noise, loud enough so no one is ever forgotten again. Bernard Jackson was not a hero created afterward. He was a real man who walked through battlefields with a loyalty never diminished by the color of his skin. He did not shout for justice, nor did he carry banners or call for anger. He simply lived with discipline, stepping out each day as if honor still held meaning, and then he fell in a moment when all those principles were broken by a dogmatic misconception. The story did not begin with a gunshot, but with a look, with suspicion, with how the system placed a black soldier in a position where he had to prove himself, even when the uniform he wore should have done that already. When Bernard fell, with his military ID in hand, a boundary was crossed. But what made the story impossible to bury was how the military did not remain silent, but stood up straight. Every question raised, every summons issued, every cold glance in the hearing room reflected one truth: honor has no place for guilty silence. The 7-person council did not ask who Bernard was. They asked the trigger puller why he fired despite knowing. And the answer, a poor string of excuses, did not save Dalton from consequences no longer under civilian jurisdiction. The closed trial, internal orders, and letters from the military community did not create triumph. They clarified one thing: when an officer is killed on his own country's soil, in peacetime, not by war but by skin color, silence becomes complicity if no one dares to speak up. Bernard did not come back to life, nor was he canonized, but from his loss many things became clearer. The fear of being remembered is greater than the fear of being accused, and the system can only stand if someone is willing to draw the line between law and truth. Punishment does not create change, but discipline sets limits. The quietly posted photos in police stations, the quotes appearing in training classes, the haunting gaze of Bernard in drawings hung in hallways, all these do not aim to glorify a name, but remind that a title is not born from a uniform, but from every person's choice when facing power in their hands. And in this case, the one with power chose wrongly. No medal honors Bernard, but a corner of the park where he once sat reading the newspaper, where his shadow once fell, is marked by a small plaque just big enough to make passers-by pause a few seconds. There, the lesson is written in the fewest words. This is where he once sat reading, not dying. It does not explain or narrate, but it does not allow forgetting. We do not tell this story to stir anger, but to keep an anchor for what is right amid countless deviation. If anything keeps Bernard alive in the memory of those who have seen his photo, it is that he did not die quietly. He forced the entire system to look at itself, forcing each person to ask, if I were there, could I keep my hand off the trigger? The answer is not in law books, nor does it require rank or insignia. It lies in every decision, every glance, every choice. And sometimes that choice does not begin with courage, but with the refusal of cowardice. That is why Bernard does not need a statue. His legacy has crept into hallways, into memories, into the whispered question that those in uniform are beginning to ask themselves each time they raise a hand to their hip. This time, is someone watching? And if so, make sure they see what is right. Because what is right, though not easy to live with, is the only thing that keeps a person inside the shell of power. Bernard did not die in silence. So do not let that lesson die silently in your own life. Because every time you hold back the trigger, you save not one person, but preserve an entire principle. And that principle, from that day forward, has a name: Bernard's Rule. Thank you for following this story to its final moment. Bernard Jackson did not need a national funeral or grand tributes because what he left behind does not rest on a stone monument or a stage. He left a question, echoed in every watch shift, every training session, every time a weapon is drawn. What truly defines an honorable person? And if you have ever thought that silence kills no one, remember, it once killed a man like Bernard. It once killed a man like So, if tomorrow you witness injustice, do not turn away. If you see power misused, raise your voice. You don't have to be a soldier, you just need to stand tall, as Bernard once did. Because justice has no skin color, and honor sometimes begins with an unyielding look.